Now, we could also choose an alternative scenario. We could choose one that's much more concerned about environmental future. It'll be one where we'll have less sea level rise. We'll have about 1/3 less sea level rise, only about 2/3 of a foot of sea level rise. But it's also a future where we'll be less rich. We'll be about 1/3 less rich. Notice it'll still be a much richer future by the end of the century. Now, my very simple question is, if we engage in trying to go for the environmental future instead of the economic future, at least it means that there'll be less sea level rise. Wouldn't that be better for Bangladeshis? Wouldn't that mean that the Bangladeshis would lose less dry land? Well, the question really is, where do Bangladesh lose the less dry land? It turns out that's in the economic future. They lose much less dry land in the economic future. Why? Because it's not just about sea level rise, it's also about how rich you are. And it turns out that the fact that they're much richer also means that they can deal much better with the increasing sea level rise. So even when we look at the parameter that is presumably the most important one for many environmentalists, we've actually done Bangladesh a disfavor by saying we want it to focus on the environment when what they wanted was to focus on the economy, because that would make them richer, make them much better able to deal with their futures. So again, my point here is both when you look at heat deaths, especially in the first world, and when you look at sea level rise, especially in the third world, we get the same answer. We have to stop realizing just one side of the impact, namely more heat deaths or the fact that we're going to see more flooding, but we also have to realize it's about getting air conditioning, it's about making cities cooler and heat and cold deaths, and when we're talking about sea level rise, it's about making people richer. So again, we come back to saying there's something fundamentally wrong about this very one-dimensional view of saying it's all about cutting carbon emissions. Let me take a look at the third point that Al Gore tells us, that we're going to see ever more damaging hurricanes. He's actually right about that. If you look, this is the data that we have for the US over the last 105 years. This is the cost of impacts from hurricanes for the US. And what you're essentially seeing is a dramatic increase. Obviously, the 2004 and 2005 with Hurricane Katrina is huge. Notice this is Hurricane Andrew in 1992. You remember that was the biggest one before? Totally dwarfed by 2004, 2005. Incidentally, you might want to know that there were almost zero in 2006 and 2007, but it still doesn't reject the fact that there is a dramatic increase. Al Gore's absolutely right about that. The problem is this has very little to do with global warming. It has everything to do with demographics. Basically, a lot more people live very close to where hurricanes hit. Because when hurricanes don't hit, it's a really nice place to live, right? If you look at the US population, it's quadrupled over the last 100 years. But the Florida coastal population increased 50-fold in the same period. So it's not surprising there's a lot more people to be damaged. At the same time, of course, we also have a situation where many more people have much more stuff to be damaged. So it's not very surprising that even though it would just be the same amount of hurricanes hitting, we would see much more damage. Actually, some researchers then said, what would have happened if all US hurricanes over the last 105 years had hit the US as it looks today in 2007? This is what they came up with, a very different picture. It actually turns out that the most damaging hurricane ever in the US would have been the Great Miami Hurricane in 1926, much more damaging than Hurricane Katrina. It tore right through downtown Miami. It actually killed more people than were killed in Hurricane Katrina. But of course, there was nothing to damage back then. It was all sheds. That's not entirely true, but you get the point, right? The idea here is to say, this is obviously indicating that we are misunderstanding the main point here. The second most damaging would be the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900, which tore right through Galveston. It was actually the most damaging hurricane in US history, killing about 15,000 people. About 10 times as many as died in Hurricane Katrina. But again, there's nothing to damage of material worth back then. So what we're essentially seeing is more people with more stuff. It's not that hurricanes get more ferocious. Now, there's some arguments, there's theoretical arguments that hurricanes will actually get more damaging from climate change. But let's just take a look at some of the reasonable worst-case scenarios and look out till 2050 and say, well, how much more damage are we going to see from climate change? Well, it turns out that we will probably see about 10% more damage from climate change by mid-century. That means if we could entirely avoid climate change, we could cut about 10% of the increase. Now, that'd be good. I'd certainly like to see that. If we do the Kyoto Protocol, we could probably cut about half a percentage point from that. But what we are failing to realize is that the social factors, the fact that more people with more stuff are going to be closer to harm's way, is actually going to increase damages about 500% in the same time frame. Again, isn't it curious that we're only focused on dealing with this one that we can do something about very poorly at very high cost, whereas nobody has a conversation about how we can deal with a 500% increase. If we actually want, and presumably that's what we want, help people in 2050 not being damaged by hurricanes, why is it we're focused on the most expensive way to help people the least? Very few people actually have a conversation. This is one of the places where I think you could make a big difference. How would we reduce this? Well, of course, it's about, for instance, stopping insurance, subsidizing insurance in Florida, which is essentially encouraging people to build irresponsibly. It's about having better insurance codes. It's also about, building codes. It's also about having better policing of building codes. It's about having better wetlands in front of Louisiana. And obviously, it's about having better levees around New Orleans. It's about having all these very sensible, very smart, very boring, but ultimately much more important things that would actually make a big difference to how people would live in 2050. So again, the point that I'm trying to make is it's not wrong to say that yes, there are going to be impacts by global warming, but it's wrong to put them up as starkly. It's wrong to not tell the other side of the story, and it's especially wrong not to point out that for virtually all of these impacts, there are much better policies, much cheaper, and much better outcomes for most people. And that leads me to the third point. Yes, global warming is real, but it's often vastly exaggerated and leading to bad judgment. That's why we need to find smarter ways to deal with this problem. We need to realize that what we're doing right now will do virtually no good. The Kyoto or even the EU's new promise to cut its emissions 20% below 1990 levels. If we all did the Kyoto Protocol, including the US, and kept that on for the rest of this century, we would have postponed global warming by the end of the century by about 5 years. We wouldn't be able to measure the impact even in 100 years. That's the truth. This is what all the climate models show us. We can cut a lot now, and it'll have virtually no impact even 100 years down the line. Why is it then that we're so focused on doing more of the same thing? This would cost about $180 billion, yet do virtually no good even 100 years from now. That's the main point of starting to realize that what we're trying to do is essentially bleed ourselves to death, and we're actually not going to see any good come out of it. It's not going to have any impact now. It's not even going to have a measurable impact in 100 years. That's why I think we need to have smarter solutions. But before I take you to the smarter solutions, let me just show you, because I think this encapsulates the whole discussion very well. This is also how I opened the book. Take polar bears, because polar bears in many ways have encapsulated the whole climate change debate. And most people think that polar bears are immediately threatened, that they're actually doing incredibly poorly. That's not the case. Our estimates show that there's probably been a quadrupling of polar bears over the last 50 years. So the global population was probably about 5,000 to 10,000 in the 1960s. Now it's probably about 22,000. But this does not mean that with increasing temperature rises, especially in the Arctic, with diminishing and eventually disappearing summer Arctic ice, we will probably see a problem for polar bears. But the question that I then dare to ask is doing cutting carbon emission really the right way? Is doing the Kyoto Protocol really the right way? Why is nobody telling you how much that would help polar bears? Well, I have a clue. It's probably because it doesn't sound very good. It turns out if you do the numbers, if we did the Kyoto Protocol, if everybody did the Kyoto Protocol, we could save one polar bear every year.